Okay, before I begin, a couple of things to just put my paper in the context of this conference. First, I think I'm the first speaker who does not have a PowerPoint presentation. So I think I'm going to have to do my best to try and switch on the projectors in your heads. And, and second, I think there are two ways one can visualize your relationship with the sacred. One is that you need to define and understand the sacred so you can reach out and include it in your life. And the other is that you don't need to make an effort. The sacred will do all the effort. In fact, it doesn't even need to find you. You are already the sacred. And perhaps it is more productive to turn your attention to your consciousness, the sensitivity of your receptiveness, so you stop blocking out the sacred. And perhaps my paper is more aligned with this latter approach. So to jump into it. From Hindu and Buddhist concepts of meditation as a path for spiritual discovery to the biblical injunction, be still and know that I am God, many faiths have rightly emphasized that stillness is a foundation for spiritual understanding. A prerequisite for stillness is slowness, for it is difficult to shift to stillness from a state of speed. If you wish to create cities that are conducive to spiritual growth, it is necessary to critically examine this history and seek how we may work towards slow urbanism. Now, my paper contains an outline of this history, but I do not have time to present it. So I'm going to jump to the concluding paragraph of this history, which deals with the current state of the cyber city that's embedded within a new form of globalization, whose distinguishing characteristic is that for the first time, distant locations can be coordinated in real time. This allows entities within the city to secede from the local economy and anchor within global networks. As Manuel Castells describes it, we are now anchored within the space of flows rather than the space of places. Time has lost its sense of time in the cyber city. High volume transactions, financial transactions of a scale that overshadow the physical economy of places take place within microseconds. Evocative images circulate across the world in literally the flash of an eye. And the speed with which one ethos displaces another has accelerated over time to the point where the displacement has become an end in itself, a high adrenaline rock beat to which culture dances. If the traditional craftsman epitomizes the aesthetic of the pre-industrial city and the avant-garde artist that of the industrial city, the aesthetic of the cyber city is best represented by the metaphor of a surfer, balanced with exhilaration on the technological cutting-edge wave of ecstasy speed. So we now face the problematic situation of a politically passive urban citizenry in a world of increasing inequality, accepting of a postmodern relativism where anything goes, anchored more in narcissistic indulgence than social ideals, and possessed by the demon of speed. If we seek the foundation of stillness necessary for spiritual understanding and growth, how can we shift the trajectory towards a slow urbanism? A critique aimed at reform cannot take on this situation directly. There are few spaces with the autonomy to construct resistance. Networks quickly reorganize to bypass points of direct resistance. And the scarcity of attention in an age of overabundant information is not sympathetic to the widespread dissemination of deep ideas. As we are in a network world, the critique must employ network logic rather than rational argument, seemingly preoccupied with something else, assembling networks till they reach a scale where they are difficult to ignore because they have struck chords that are innate and resonant to the human condition and thereby resist the speed of the global network. Network logic requires recognition of self-organizing emergent systems, that is, systems that allow the bottom-up emergence of fundamental properties not previously observed as functional characteristics of the system. The epitome of such a system, often quoted, is a termite's nest, where a high level of macro intelligence, functional zoning, traffic hierarchies, climate control, waste disposal, etc., is seen with no evidence of an overarching leadership or intelligence that conceives the system. Termites, when they move, exude a chemical signal called a pheromone, allowing them to sense the pattern of termites that have moved before them. The intelligence of the system emerges from a simple and basic set of rules genetically ingrained into every termite, such as if you sense a pheromone trail like this, put a piece of mud like that. From this, the fundamental conditions for emergence could be described as high synchrony, frequent interaction. Actions and interactions leave traces of themselves. There is an impulse towards pattern recognition in the traces. There are high levels of information symmetry, as all information is in the public domain. There is a high preoccupation with immediate engagement and a low preoccupation with grand design or concept. As Stephen Johnson notes, the human brain is an emergent system that would cease to function if each neuron sought to be individually sentient. The system is not based on the downward implementation of overarching concepts. It is founded on simple processes of direct everyday engagement and develops upwards from there through iterative evolutionary spirals of pattern recognition. So if these spirals of pattern recognition depend on the traces of daily engagement, what are the traces we can leave of our actions? We have an image of the information age as an era where information zips seamlessly and without resistance all over the world. But this is not the way information actually flows. As John Seely Brown and Paul Duguid have pointed out in their book, The Social Life of Information, there are certain contexts and conditions that induce information into sticking there. A place where information sticks is one that is imbued with memory, and memory is one of the fundamental traces that we leave of our actions. Memory can be crucial to resisting the speed of the global network, for there is an inherent connection between memory and slowness. Milan Kundera writes in his novel Slowness, and I quote, "There is a secret bond between slowness and memory, between speed and forgetting. Consider this utterly commonplace situation. A man is walking down the street. At a certain moment, he tries to recall something, but the recollection escapes him. Automatically, he slows down. Meanwhile, a person who wants to forget a disagreeable incident he has just lived through starts unconsciously to speed up his pace, as if he were trying to distance himself from a thing still too close to him in time. In existential mathematics, that experience takes the form of two basic equations. The degree of slowness is directly proportional to the intensity of memory. The degree of speed is directly proportional to the intensity of forgetting," unquote. From this point of view, we need to seek a re-evaluation of the civic realm of the city, moving away from an exclusive focus on its socio-political dimensions and anchoring in the social contract, and also defining it as a space for depositing memory. In other words, we must discover how memory infuses the spatial. When we connect memory with space, we touch on some fundamental issues. Firstly, embedded into the inhabitation of any space is the fact that there will always be some things that are proximate and some that are distant. This becomes crucial in a world where distant locations are connected in real time and geographies emerge that do not depend on local adjacency. Jean Baudrillard writes in his essay, The Ecstasy of Communication, that the nature of alienation has fundamentally changed. Earlier, alienation was characterized by distance and isolation from the fundamental properties of life. But now, alienation is characterized by an overwhelming proximity to everything. Reflection and stillness require the construction of sheltered space, which requires the construction of distance. And this came more easily in earlier years, but actually requires quite an effort in today's age. So if we link our memories to space, we would begin to characterize what in our history is proximate and what is distant. And this would be the first step in reproducing the sense of an unalienated self. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, our memories are tied to the way we inhabit space. Francis Yates writes of a technique used by orators in ancient Rome who had to give long and complex speeches without the aid of written notes, a mnemonic aid that we take for granted today. And the way they did it was they used the architecture of the space where they were going to make a speech as a mnemonic device. So the columns, doors, niches, windows, and other tectonic elements, each one of them was constructed as a reminder of a specific point in the speech. Yates argues that this technique demonstrates that we do not just receive meaning from a space, we also have the capacity to write our own meaning into it. Primo Levi, in an essay on his own home, recalls this technique used by the Roman orators and goes on to observe, this technique would never work for me in my own home because every corner is already occupied by authentic memories which would interfere with the fictitious ones that this technique demands. Levi's observation, which strikes an immediate emotional chord in us, shows that to inhabit a space over time is to write memory and meaning into it. This process of generating architectural meaning is not overly dependent on the didactic intentions usually espoused by architects, and is actually one that begins after the architect has completed the project and has stepped away from it. The tangibility of embedded memory is not a problematic issue at the level of private residential space. The intimacy at this scale, the security controls that limit the space to those who share a common purpose or way of life, and the strong interrelation with daily routine all serve to preserve the palpability of memory to those who regularly inhabit the space. The problem arises when we step into the complexity and heterogeneity of the public realm. There was a time when neighborhoods, if not entire cities, were relatively culturally homogeneous. Memories resided within the minds of the residents, and an oral culture sustained the construction of public memory at a foundational first level of the civic realm. This is no longer possible. The oral culture of urban neighborhoods is now too infected with the global, destabilized by mobility, and imbued with forms of the textual and visual that are not place-bound to hold any power on its own. This fact has created a schism between the private and public realms of the city, for the public realm has lost its grassroots connection with memory and therefore tends to be excessively shaped by the memories sanctioned and propagated by the structures of power. But we now have the possibility of network logic and can deploy the virtual world of cyberspace to our cause. If the cyber technologies of social networking, Facebook, etc., that currently prevail create connections that are found to be superficial or ephemeral, it is because these networks use persons as their nodes rather than places, and these persons are without strong anchors, for the network identities float freely in the space of flows. A networking technology whose nodes are places rather than people, centered on maps that have a correspondence with physical places, would be very different. It would provide a spatial repository for memory that establishes a connection between the virtual and physical, thereby increasing the stickiness between memory and place, and it would challenge the authority of maps. We tend to view maps of our cities as representing an actual reality that is out there, whose authority of description cannot be easily challenged, as the map has been constructed by arcane specialist disciplines such as cartography and surveying, or captured by high technologies such as satellites. But it is possible to view maps very differently. If one looks at the history of maps of the world from the 10th to the 16th centuries, one finds that the maps at the beginning of this period are imprecise, vague, and approximate. But as the capabilities for transoceanic navigation and travel achieve new heights in the 14th and 15th centuries, the maps acquire an amazing level of precision, accuracy, and detail. The map can be therefore reconceptualized as a repository for memories of journeys undertaken and experiences gained. And as the journeys and experiences get more accomplished, the map also evolves. If we could evolve such an interactive and evolutionary relationship with the map of the city we live in, our relationship with the city could change. As our experiences in the city accumulate, we deposit the memories of those experiences on the map, and the map becomes a representation of our evolving relationship with the city. And if the map is also a virtual base for social networking, we have the opportunity to explore what happens when our memories intersect with the memories of others. The representations on the map will never remain abstract, for they are intimately connected with the authenticity of lived experience in physical spaces that we regularly visit. The construction of a repository for memory is only the first step. Finding resonances in the intersection between memories, the pattern recognition and traces, takes the quest to a new level that forms the foundation for authenticity. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor observes that authenticity is like language. Even though the capacity for it is innate to us, we can only realize it through dialogue and engagement. And if we refrain from or are cut off from dialogue, this capacity will lie unused and unknown. Through acts of engagement, through the resonance we find in others, we discover our innate capacity for life with all of its poetics and beauty, and we are unlikely to find such true meaning in purely rational constructions. What matters most is the intensity and empathy with which we immerse ourselves in engagement with others, and the starting point with which we begin any quest is relatively unimportant. This runs against the grain of how we are educated, where we are trained to first find overarching ideas that will then give meaning to our lives. However, it is naturally aligned with the poetics of how we intuitively live. We do not find our friends through first constructing a philosophy of friendship. In fact, if you tried that, you probably wouldn't have any friends. We find them by engaging with them, listening to them, and the resonances we discover through this process form the foundation of love and friendship. But friendship cannot survive for long on the initial discoveries of resonance. It requires continuing engagement between friends. As friends engage with each other in each act of engagement, they relive the friendship, and thus the friendship lives on. Similarly, the resonance we discover in our memories will become abstract and eventually wither away if we do not find a way of continually re-engaging with them in order to keep them alive. One primary way of keeping a memory alive is to reenact it. When we create rituals in our lives, the celebration of birthdays, anniversaries, festivals as a primary example, we are in effect reenacting our history. And when we do so, our history becomes something less abstract and something real that is intrinsically embedded into our lives. It loses its abstraction because it is continuously and rhythmically brought out of the past and into the present, and therefore can live in our heart and mind. Another way to keep memory alive is to retell it. Reenactment of memory happens relatively easily when the memory is tied to a specific event that can be ritualized. But such memories form a small percentage of overall memory, and the vast mass of memories can only be kept alive when we retell them. This retelling was absolutely necessary in an oral culture because if a memory was not retold, it was lost. And therefore, the retelling was also a gesture of selection of a memory that must not be lost. But once we have constructed written repositories, we always feel we can return to the repository whenever we want to, and therefore we do not actively pursue the act of remembering. Over time, we also forget how rarely we visit the repository. And when we cease to visit the repository, we not only cease to recover memories, we also cease to deposit memories. In doing so, we detach the repository from its source of life, and it eventually dies, and we become disconnected from our memory and lose the ability to discern what memories must not be lost. This disconnection occurs because the repositories are abstracted from our lives. Constructing a technology of social networking that maps our memories onto the spaces of everyday urban life would dispel a primary level of abstraction. But that is not enough, for the technology must enable two further levels. Firstly, it should enable the construction of connections between memories so that in those connections we can perceive the resonances of authenticity. And secondly, the technology must enable acts of retelling, for in retelling we not only keep memory alive, but we also connect with our mythical imagination. Jean-Francis Lyotard analyzes traditional oral cultures whose knowledge is structured in the form of mythical narratives. Using Lyotard's analysis, when I reflect on the myths that my grandmother narrated to me, I realize that her telling is not tied to an original author of the myth and is premised on a time when she listened to it. In my listening, I'm acquiring the authority to retell at a later moment. The story of the myth is all about dilemmas and facing the forces of nature, culture, and the universe, about seeking to resolve conflicts of love, greed, envy, and desire, a resolution that not only calls upon all of the protagonist's wits, but also of all the magic that can be called upon in this universe. In other words, the story is about what we face in our lives. There is no split between past and present, for while the narrative may be based in a distant past, its reality is contemporaneous in the way it is brought alive in a specific retelling. In the retelling, we are not only able to occupy past and present, but also occupy all three positions of teller, listener, and story. Orthodoxy emerges when the quest for power seeks to divide tellers and listeners into separate categories. But if orthodoxy can be kept at bay, the system recycles both knowledge and authority, and there is no privileged position of authority other than that whose respect is earned through the wisdom distilled and accrued from the number of retellings one has lived through. A space that is permeated with memory is a space of relative slowness. Firstly, the impulse to memory in its reach towards the past is an act of intrinsic resistance to the speed of time. But when the space becomes a site of retelling of memory, it takes on a new dimension. A specific event is always subjected to the entropy of time. But when that event is also beat in a cadence of retelling, then the moment in time foregrounds this rhythm of retelling as much as it privileges the accent of a specific occasion. In the retelling is a proposition that renews what is worth remembering, and this resonant rhythm of memory keeps alive a flame of constancy in the human spirit that imbues the place with stillness. A culture that is rooted in memory has no conflict between modernity and tradition. It recognizes that the true tradition is not that which blindly accepts the past, or repeats the past, but that which develops the rigorous practices and abilities to accept and confront all the vicissitudes of life and continuously extricate what is constant and timeless. To do so requires the freedom to discern. So the culture has to be emergent from individual freedoms rather than requiring a priori definition in a social contract, and can therefore build on modernity's initial premise of the autonomy and freedom of the individual will. And in the resonances of memory, we find not only authenticity and poetry, but also tradition and community. In the rhythms of memory, we intertwine past, present, and future, and we evolve by sustaining the ability to choose what is worth remembering. And in that choice, we perform the crucial cultural task of transforming memory into aspiration. To be cultural is to come together to remember, and the success with which we can equip our cities to handle memory will be a key determinant of our fate. Thank you.